As Nazi Germany and Britain dueled for air superiority, aircraft designers rushed to get their fledgling jet fighters operational. The RAF's Gloucester Meteor became the world's first jet to go into service in July 1944, the same month that the Messerschmitt Me-262 was just beginning its trials.
At that time, the top Allied aircraft, performance-wise, had a top speed of 446 miles an hour, and when I tested the Me-262 at Farnborough, we had a top speed of 568 miles an hour, 125 miles an hour faster than the fastest Allied fighter.
The Messerschmitt Me-262 revealed the future of aerial warfare, in which high-speed jet fighters would dominate the skies. Although very quick, the 262 could not fly supersonic, but the race to fly fastest was on. The Miles M.52, Britain's contender in the race to go supersonic, is just a few months away from its maiden flight. But the American Bell X-1 has moved quickly off the drawing board and is rolled out of the hangar ahead of its British rival in December 1945.
There's no doubt about it. We were the foremost nation in the world. We were ahead of the Germans in transonic testing. And the Americans acknowledged this.
By early 1946, Miles aircraft were confident that the M.52 would win the race to go supersonic. But on the 13th of March, they received a stunning blow.
When news of the cancellation was telephoned to F.G. Miles, I just don't think he could believe it. It just came completely out of the blue and as a total shock. Everybody was shocked.
Sadly, the M.52 project was cancelled very abruptly, shortly before the prototype was due to be completed and to start its flight trials. The news apparently came out of the blue. My parents and everybody else working on the project were quite horrified. There were various reasons ostensibly given, one of which was that it was too dangerous to ask test pilots to risk their lives flying a supersonic aeroplane, which had never been done before. That, after all, is what test pilots do.
Without warning, the leading contender to break the sound barrier was scrapped by the Supersonic Committee of the Ministry of Supply and Aircraft Production.
We got a cancellation, stop all work, so all the labour was taken off it and put on other things, so that we just closed the doors and were told that we had to collect all the drawings and photographs and pieces and everything else and put it into this bay, and the ministry would then take it away.
At the time of the cancellation, Dennis had been confident that the M.52's first test flight was imminent.
The first aircraft was a few weeks away from its first test flight, and the second aeroplane, the supersonic, was mostly 6 or 9 months away. But we were so disgusted at that stage to cancel it, which we felt was a certain success, almost certain success, so close to completion. It was absolutely crazy.
Dennis and Elizabeth Bancroft suspect that secret British cooperation with the American X-1 project could have been a factor behind the cancellation.
Recently, I've come across an American report in the American archive that says that one of our directors entertained 2 American visitors to the aerodrome at Woodley, I think in
July 46.
Yes, in July 1946, which was 6 months afterwards. And the real aeroplane, because they felt it and there was a sharp edge and they had to get underneath it.
And these 2 Americans reported back via their London intelligence headquarters to Wright Field in America.
About a year after the 2 American visitors inspected the M.52 at the Miles factory, the Bell X-1 was delivered to Muroc Airfield in California.
But it is quite obvious when you look at the X1 that an awful lot of the information on our drawings has produced something that looks extraordinarily like an M.52. Not in detail, because it had a rocket motor and it didn't have escape and things, but the shape.
Well, the Americans went for a rocket motor because they thought that they knew so little about jets. It would take years to develop a jet. They couldn't produce a jet. As it was a rocket, you couldn't take off and fly it because there wasn't enough fuel, so that you had to take it up with an aeroplane and just drop it, and then light the blue paper. And
So it wasn't really an aeroplane, it was a dropped body.
Yeah, flying rocket.
Dropped body.
Yeah, with wings.
Meow.
But the only useful information which they used, I think, was that we were designing and building a supersonic aeroplane, and we were convinced that it would work. And that just drove them on. As if we could do it, they could do it. So that's all they took away. But they didn't understand the rest of the technical information that they had in their briefcase.
In the autumn of 1947, the X-1 was ready to start test flights. The large dried-out lake bed in the Mojave Desert was a huge natural airstrip, and the only place in America where the X-1 could land safely. Test pilot Bob Hoover was assigned to fly the chase plane that supported the X-1.
Chuck was one of the few pilots I really respected and felt was highly qualified to do just about anything.
With each successive flight, Chuck Yeager gradually increased the X-1's speed. A B-29 bomber carried the X-1 aloft, as there was only enough fuel to light up the 4 volatile rockets for a few minutes.
The most critical thing he had was somebody above him cautioning him not to go any faster than some small amount of speed each time. He would have done it a lot sooner if they'd permitted him to do so. But he had to be really disciplined. I'm not sure I would have been that disciplined.
On the 10th of October 1947, Yeager took off on his 8th flight. The aim was to reach 94% of the speed of sound. After the X-1 was dropped from the B-29, Yeager approached the speed of sound. He was flying faster than anyone had flown before. Suddenly, he discovered that the X-1 would not respond to movements of the control yoke. The plane would not climb nor descend.
The sound barrier is a very, very positive thing. It really means that because an aircraft normally in normal flight sends a pressure wave ahead, which opens up the path for it through the air for it to progress. But as the speed of the aircraft increases and you get near the speed of sound, there is less warning given to cause the pressure waves to break up the air, and they bank up on each other. So eventually you run into what in effect is a brick wall. And this causes changes in lift, huge amount of vibration, and a very big change in trim. If it runs away from you, you get into what the Americans so delightfully call a graveyard dive. And there is no way really back from that. The barrier is not just theoretical, it is very, very factual.
To stop the buffeting, Yeager quickly turned off the engines and jettisoned the explosive rocket fuel. As the X-1 slowed down, the aircraft once again responded to movements of the stick. But if the flight control problems could not be solved, Yeager would not be able to fly supersonic. The X-1's tail incorporated a feature to enable the pilot to adjust trim. So far, it had not been utilized in any of the test flights. When activated, it enabled the pilot to trim the aircraft by moving the entire horizontal stabilizer. It was, in effect, an all-moving tail. Bob Hoover recalls a crucial contribution made by Jack Ridley, another member of the X-1 team.
Chuck told him he was beginning to lose elevator control at high speeds. Jack came up with the idea of move the stabilizer up and down to give you more authority on the elevators and angle of attack, so it could hold the nose up. And when that happened, we knew Chuck had a real good chance of getting through it without any problems.
On his 9th flight on October 14, 1947, Yeager wanted to find out if Jack Ridley's advice to use the trim switch would give him control at speeds approaching Mach 1. If moving the complete horizontal stabilizer still did not give Yeager pitch control, the result could be fatal. Unlike the M.52, there was no provision for pilot escape in the X-1. As Yeager approached the speed of sound, the X-1 began to buck and pitch. He pushed the yoke forward. Would the all-moving stabilizer bring the X-1 back into level flight? Soon after losing sight of the X-1, the telemetry team heard a loud bang. It was the sound of the first sonic boom.
He went by me, supersonic, and the reason I knew that, I was in a P-80, and it was an 8/10 Mach number airplane. Well, I remember it very well, very clearly, because I knew it was history being made.
As the needle went off the Mach meter, the buffeting stopped. Beyond the sound barrier, Yeager discovered that air flowed smoothly over the X-1. Yeager had reached Mach 1.06, 700 miles an hour at 14,000 feet, in a flight time of 14 minutes. The sound barrier had finally been broken. When the M.52 team at Miles Aircraft heard that the all-moving stabilizer on the tail was crucial to the success of the X-1, they felt robbed.
Now, the flying tail is the fundamental innovation that the Americans got from us, and which was the thing that made the X-1 the first aircraft to break the sound barrier. Because the X-1 had run into an impassable stage in the tests at a Mach number of 0.94. And of course the flying tail is the one thing that will get you through the compressibility problems in any transonic flight.
But a year before work on the M.52 started, some research on an all-flying tail had already taken place in the United States. Early in 1942, an all-moving tail was tested on a Curtiss XP-42 fighter to see if it improved control in high-speed dives. Up to now, no detailed engineering drawings of the M.52, with its all-flying tail, had been found amongst the Bell X-1 project files. But recently, this rough sketch of the M.52 was discovered in the archives of the Smithsonian Museum. It comes from the notebook of an American intelligence gatherer, Captain John J. Ide.
It's a very rough sketch, probably not more than about an inch or two across, giving brief details of span and weight and stuff like that. And it was dated August 1945, which is rather intriguing because we've got no record of any visits to Miles in August 1945. And we're wondering where he could have got that information from.
2 months earlier, an aerodynamicist working for the Navy by the name of Clark Millikan also visited the Miles factory. His report concluded that the M.52 had little of use for US aircraft designers, and there was no need to obtain additional information from the British government. However, his report did state that the all-moving horizontal tail of the M.52 might be of interest.
I've always thought that the Americans were behind the cancellation of the M.52 in one way or another, either through pressure on a loan that we desperately needed, or through the fact that they wanted to be the first to break through the sound barrier. But having delved through records of governmental activities through Hansard and the cabinet meetings, we could find absolutely nothing.
The government established a supersonic committee to monitor the M52 project, but it had no representative from Miles Aircraft.
There was no representation from Miles on it. In fact, it was 35 years before we even knew that they had a supersonic committee meeting every month. And they were just making decisions with actually wrong information. And the minutes of the meeting show that the information that they were talking about was completely wrong on many instances.
In 1944, Ben Lockspicer, the chairman of the Supersonic Committee, asked Barnes Wallis of Vickers Aircraft and Dambuster bouncing bomb fame to become a member.
Having got a foot in the door of the Supersonic Committee, he then very heavily influenced its thinking. And in my opinion, this could have been a severe setback in the progress of the M52 politically. And I think probably was quite a strong contributory factor to the eventual cancellation of the M52 as such.
Barnes Wallis believed a manned supersonic test aircraft would probably kill its pilot. He proposed a series of unmanned tests using scale models powered by rockets and launched from a Mosquito. The scale models would be built by his company Vickers.
A change, or a psychological change, had occurred to Barnes Wallis. The famous Dambusters raid had cost quite a number of casualties, and this preyed on Barnes Wallis's conscience very heavily indeed. And he had openly stated that he would not now take part in anything that he thought would mean sending a young man out to his death as a pilot or aircrew. And therefore, he promoted on the Supersonic Committee the use of rocket models instead of a full-scale model of the M52. I think his concern about safety was genuine, but I think there was also a strong commercial interest running through all this. And we will never know eventually, of course, but at the end of the day, it had a devastating effect on the M52 as a piloted project.
For 7 years, we, the people of Britain, fought a war for mankind. Today we fight for our own survival. This battle we shall also win.
No doubt we're in a bit of a tough spot, and it'll take a year or two to get out. But we've done it before, and we can do it again.
So why did the government suddenly cancel the M52?
It is a bit of a mystery, but no government minister ever made a comment. It was a socialist government, a sort of in power, if that's the word at the time, that were absolutely dependent on foreign aid. They were absolutely bankrupt over the war.
In addition to saving test pilots' lives, the Supersonic Committee claimed that using rocket-powered models would save money.
No, that was a total red herring. I think at first it was put up as a money-saving project, but of course that did not prove to be the case. In fact, the contrary proved to be the case. Whereas the M52 would probably have cost about $250,000 to complete the project, the Barnes Wallis project certainly was running into $400,000 to $500,000. So there was quite a difference.
Although Ben Lockspicer, the chief scientist, has taken the blame for it all these years, we've discovered that he must have been the mouthpiece, and that the actual cancellation would have been ordered by his boss, which was John Wilmot, the Minister of Supply and Aircraft Production at the time, in order to make cutbacks, purely on economic grounds, which turned out to be absolutely ridiculous, but that's the way it appears to have gone.
More than 60 years later, the cancellation of the project, when it was so close to succeeding, continues to irk the M.52 team.
Livid, hopping mad, because to me it was utter betrayal. We were not given any prior warning of this decision. We were 82% complete for the first flight when it was cancelled. We had no tricky bits at that stage. The main components were all in place.
And it would have worked, and it would have actually flown, and it would have produced the information we wanted, and our frontline aircraft would have been that much better 2 or 3 years earlier.
I look at it as one of the worst decisions that ever happened in British aviation, because it happened at a critical time when we could have been the lead country.
The engine, the W2700, would have been an aft fan engine with reheat. Well, that in itself was a very advanced project, very advanced form of turbojet. It incorporated both turbofan ideas as well as the use of reheat. By cancelling that, which is really peculiar, the government simply turned their back on something that, which of course came along later, done by others. GE were the first to produce an aft fan engine in 1961. Frank Whittle was also working on a front fan axial compressor engine, the LR1, the long range one, and he'd started work on that in 1943. So really it is a mystery as to why we threw the baby out with the bathwater when we cancelled the LR1 front turbofan and the W2700 aft turbofan. We put ourselves way onto the back burner.
He was angry, we were angry. We couldn't see the reason for it. But it took us some years to realise that it wasn't just technical. There was a lot of political angst in it as well.
The ministry's explanation never satisfied the M.52 designers. The timing of the decision also made the M.52 team suspicious. It occurred just 2 months after Frank Whittle resigned as chairman of Powerjets, the company that had developed the jet engine for the M.52, and which had recently been nationalised by the government.
The government couldn't cope with Whittle, there's no doubt about that, and to have Miles on top of it, working together, probably they couldn't cope with that either, and it must have been very difficult for the powers. I don't know how they really thought they were going to cope with it, but Miles would have got the job done, there is no doubt about that.
And Whittle, who had been promised he could go on and develop new engines, was broken-hearted, of course, and he naturally became very difficult and fought madly for at least the compensation that would have enabled him to set up another private firm and compete on a legitimate level, but they weren't having that. And they threatened him with everything, loss of pension, being sacked, the works. And then, of course, I suppose some bright spark at the ministry came up with this idea about cancelling the plane so that Whittle could be quietly dropped.
I, as his son, can only say that he could be a bit fierce at times, and maybe he was a bit too fierce with some of these very self-important civilians in the ministry.
Whittle's ambitions for the future of Powerjets had been in conflict with the policy of the Ministry of Supply and Aircraft Production.
Frank's idea was that eventually his company should be able to produce jet engines as well as develop them. The Ministry of Supply begged to differ in this and said that no, that Rolls-Royce would do the production, but he would continue to do the development. And this upset Frank very much, to such an extent that he resigned as the chairman in December 1945 and left the company and took 16 of his top engineers with him. So this, to say the least, upset the Ministry of Supply, or it upset the establishment, if you want to put it that way. And to such a degree that one wonders why the cancellation of the M.52 took place just a month later, or more than a month. It just took place in February 1946.
With its Whittle power plant, the fate of the M.52 project was locked to that of the engine's inventor.
The sad conclusion that seems now to be accepted that it was cancelled as a rebuff to Sir Frank Whittle for, if you like, bucking the establishment. And one can hardly believe that a project that was going to bring so much prestige to British aviation and to the country as a whole could be cancelled just to rebuff one man. Not only sad, fantastically nasty.
In 1948, a year after Yeager's historic flight, the M.52 team had its bittersweet moment of glory. A scale model of the M.52 made by Vickers broke the sound barrier. The test demonstrated that the M.52 could have flown at 1,000 miles per hour, 1.5 times the speed of sound. Dennis Bancroft and the M.52 team were vindicated.
The great expert on swept wings in pre-war was Professor Buseman of the research establishment at Falkenrode.
(1944). A 4-engined powerhouse flies through the clear skies over Kansas. The Boeing B-29 is ready to join the war after a lengthy and troubled development that began in late 1939. With 12.50 caliber Browning machine guns and a standard loadout of 20,000 pounds of bombs, it truly lives up to its nickname, the Super Fortress. Designed as a high-altitude daytime bomber, it is intended to be used in the Pacific theater of the war. The finished planes are flown from the Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas, to the eastern tip of North America in Newfoundland, across the Atlantic Ocean to Morocco, to Iran in the Middle East, and finally to India, where they will be stationed for several months. From here, they can be sent to China, where they will be within striking distance of the home islands of Japan, which have been free from direct attacks since the Doolittle raid of 1942. But one of these bombers has a different fate. Its mission is not one of destruction, but of deception. It is flown from Kansas to Newfoundland and across the Atlantic. As its fellow B-29s are striking targets in Asia, first Bangkok's railroad shops, then the Imperial Iron and Steel Works of Japan, this one is headed for England. Instead of arriving under the cover of night, it arrives in broad daylight at RAF Bovington, northwest of London. Landing before a crowd of onlookers, it is driven up and down the runway, a show of the Allies' latest marvel of the air. And the crowds are impressed indeed. The B-29 is one of the largest aircraft ever built, at a length of 99 feet and a wingspan of 141 feet. But one of these onlookers isn't there to appreciate America's latest technological achievement. Returning home, the man is careful to conceal what he is about to do. Retrieving a straight key transmitter from a hidden location, he prepares to send a signal across the channel to Europe. There, an operator receives the message and decodes the warning about this new threat, passing the valuable information on to the headquarters of the German Air Ministry. And this is exactly the scenario the Allies have been counting on. With good knowledge of where spies in England are located, it is known that this information will be sent on to their enemy. With the war dramatically turning against them, the notion of even heavier bombing is a frightening prospect for Germany. The US Air Force's Big Week offensive in late February of 1944 had the Americans flying heavily escorted bombing missions against airframe manufacturing and assembly plants around Germany. The results have been devastating, with the Luftwaffe losing close to 100 of their fighter pilots. Panic is rising all around, and this information is making matters much worse. The Americans have leaked enough information about the new bomber for the Germans to know just how much of a threat they are facing. If the B-29 is to be used in Europe, Germany will need to form a defensive strategy to shoot them down, and this poses a problem. The B-29, with its pressurized cabin, can fly at an incredible altitude of 40,000 feet. Though some of the German army's more powerful artillery can fire to that height, the bombers will be almost impossible to hit. And as Germany has not yet developed proximity fuses, it will prove a challenge for their defenses. If B-29s do appear in the skies over Germany, they need to be brought down by other methods. With the recent development of the turbojet engine, Germany now has fighter aircraft that can fly at incredible speeds. But will that be enough to combat the threat of the B-29? The Messerschmitt Me-262 is Germany's latest jet aircraft. Powered by two Junkers Umo 004 engines, it is a deadly adversary for Allied aircraft.
Right, now the Me-262 was, in my opinion, I've stated this many times, the most formidable aircraft of World War II. When you consider that at the end of the war, the top Allied fighter was the Spitfire Mark 14 with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. When we tested the Messerschmitt 262, it had a top speed of 568 miles an hour. This was a quantum jump in performance, and it meant the 262 was virtually inviolate.
Originally straight-winged, the production version of the 262 has wings swept at an angle of 18.5 degrees. This is done to adjust the aircraft's center of gravity when the engine proved to be heavier than originally expected.
It had one shortcoming, but then I would say two shortcomings, but all the early jets did in our country, in America and in Germany. Firstly, the engines were very sensitive. They were slow to accelerate to throttle movement, and you had to handle them very carefully to avoid flaming them out. Secondly, we hadn't thought, or the designers hadn't thought, of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. And this made life very difficult, for example, for landing.
The 262's standard tactic against bomber formations approaching from a higher altitude and then diving down to their level and opening fire will not be effective against this new enemy. The 262 only holds enough fuel for approximately 1 hour in the air. It takes close to 15 minutes for the aircraft to reach its maximum altitude, not including the time it needs to locate its targets, which eats up plenty of fuel. Experiments are undertaken to see if this problem can be overcome. In one case, a rocket engine is added to a 262 to provide a boost during climbs. Another idea proposed to increase the plane's rate of climb is to mount ramjets on its wings. And while the ramjets will provide more thrust, their added weight would slow the aircraft down in level flight and deplete even more fuel. Tweaking the Me-262 is not the answer the Air Ministry is looking for. However, Germany also has a light fighter in development, the Heinkel 162. As raw materials and qualified pilots are becoming scarce, a cheap-to-produce and easy-to-replace plane is appealing. Officially named Volksjäger or People's Fighter, it is also known as the Salamander. Constructed primarily of wood, it is roughly half the weight of other fighters and houses a BMW 003 engine in a nacelle mounted on top of the fuselage.
The Heinkel 162 was certainly an intriguing idea. It was a well-designed aircraft. The catch is the Germans were running out of time. They were planning to use teenagers out of the Hitler Youth or out of the National Socialist Flying Corps, which at least had some basic training on gliders, train all these youngsters on gliders and put them on single-seat jet fighters, because there was no two-seat version of this thing, and hope for the best. Keeping in mind you had to produce these things. Again, you need the resources, you need the fuel, you need the workers. It was not an aircraft for the uninitiated. It was a jet aircraft, after all, a very high-performance machine. So put inexperienced pilots in a fairly hot machine with lots of Allied aircraft buzzing all around was not a good idea.
And despite its lightweight and high speed, the Salamander has even less endurance in the air than the Me-262, and so won't be able to combat the B-29 effectively. Several technical hurdles still need to be overcome before the next generation of German jet aircraft can take to the sky. In England, Frank Whittle's centrifugal jet engine has proved to be very reliable, able to endure over 100 hours of flying time before requiring repairs. But that reliability comes at the cost of speed. The Junkers and BMW axial flow engines, while much faster than anything the Allies have, are complicated to produce and last no longer than 12 hours in the air before a full retrofit is needed, and a total of only 25 hours until they need to be replaced. But new engine developments are on the way for Germany, courtesy of Heinkel Hirt, the HES 011 turbojet engine. Featuring a unique combination of the axial and centrifugal compressors, it promises to be easier to produce and more reliable than the other German engines.
All German project development in the latter months of the war were all based around the HES 011 engines, but then there were many other engine manufacturers who were actually developing even more powerful engines, and some of modern day airliner engines today can actually be traced back to some of those ideas.
After the First World War, Germany had been forbidden from developing military aircraft technology, but they were not stopped from the development of all technologies related to flight. So while aircraft makers in the rest of the world were working to improve the performance of powered aircraft, the Germans were designing gliders, with many engineers taking a keen interest in aerodynamics and how to use the natural forces in the atmosphere to fly further and faster. The development of the modern wind tunnel by Ludwig Prandtl opened new horizons for the testing of how various shapes dealt with airflow. As war loomed once more, there arose a need for faster aircraft, and the proliferation of wind tunnels across Germany would help in the testing of new designs. So the development of the high-speed jet engine is identifying problems that had only been seen in wind tunnels before, that straight wings lose stability just above and below the speed of sound, in what is known as the transonic region. But in theory, a swept wing will lessen the drag caused by the formation of shock waves as airflow wraps around the wings.
The great expert on swept wings in pre-war was Professor Busemann, of the research establishment at Völkenrode. And he gave an open forum lecture in Rome in 1935. And he put forward that sweeping the wings back doesn't mean you can go supersonic. What it does do is it smooths the transition from transonic flight to supersonic flight by reducing the compressibility effects. So it's a great aid on the way to supersonic flight, but it is not the key to supersonic flight.
Despite the fact that many leading aircraft experts of the day had attended the Volta conference in Rome and seen Adolf Busemann's presentation on swept wings, it was considered little more than an academic curiosity. As the airspeed record of 1935 had only been 440 miles per hour, the notion of supersonic flight seemed a very long way off. By the time World War II breaks out, Busemann's theories are all but forgotten. He conducts experimental wind tunnel tests of his theories, and by 1942 has amassed a considerable amount of technical data. Now, as planes on all sides are becoming faster and reaching the transonic region, they are witnessing the dangers that compressibility effects have on aircraft. Busemann's theories can finally come to the fore. Knowing that they have the technological advancements required to combat the B-29, Germany now needs an aircraft to house them. On July the 15th, 1944, just over a month after the D-Day landings, the Luftwaffe decides to halt all production of bombers and multi-role aircraft. Defense is now the name of the game. Calls go out to the top German aircraft manufacturers for an emergency fighter, a jet aircraft that can take on the threat posed by new Allied fighters and the American superfortress. At Messerschmitt, preliminary plans for a new fighter are drawn up. This aircraft, designated P-1101, will have a short, wide fuselage and tricycle landing gears. Willy Messerschmitt is curious about the benefit of swept wings, having researched the topic since 1940. Wind tunnel tests on models with various wing and fuselage profiles are conducted, and the differing results that each swept wing profile returns is intriguing. As many components have already been built, it is decided that the best way to get accurate test results is to build a prototype aircraft. Without the official backing of the German Air Ministry, Messerschmitt goes ahead and begins construction. It is given a mechanism that allows the wing sweep to be adjusted on the ground from 30 to 40 to 45 degrees. Other aircraft firms also submit designs for an emergency fighter. At Focke-Wulf, head designer Kurt Tank believes his team has some advantages over the competition. His FW-190 is already a workhorse for the Luftwaffe, with over 20,000 produced.
Kurt Tank was a brilliant designer, but he was also his company's assistant chief test pilot. And he had this huge advantage of knowing how to fly the airplane, and even was prepared to fly it in combat. When he flew from Bremen, whenever he was up, he would look around to see if there was any chance of getting a combat, and he was a remarkable man. He just thirsted for knowledge.
In March of 1943, one of Tank's team at Focke-Wulf had begun work on a series of design studies for a single-seat jet-engined aircraft. The man behind the designs is engineer Hans Multop. Multop had studied under Ludwig Prandtl at the University of Göttingen, where he wrote a thesis on the lift theory of wings. In 1938, Kurt Tank brought him to Focke-Wulf to work as his assistant in the Department of Developmental Aerodynamics, and by 1943, Multop had gone on to become a chief designer. Operating under the theory that the longer the distance the air must travel before it reaches the engine, the less power it will have, the Flitzer, or Madcap, is designed around a very short fuselage, with its jet intakes located at the wing roots. Its wings have a leading-edge sweep of 32 degrees. A twin boom holds the tailplane above and out of the way of the exhaust from its single HES 011 engine. The jet propulsion is to be supplemented with a Valter's liquid propellant rocket engine, but it is removed from the final designs. Curiously, the Flitzer's design is very similar to that of the Vampire, another aircraft being developed in England around the same time. It is the second jet aircraft to be commissioned by the RAF. Both the Flitzer and the Vampire are single jet-engined aircraft with a short fuselage and twin booms supporting the tailplane. This coincidence comes about not through espionage, but simply the common logic of creating a jet fighter with a single engine for better fuel economy, and to provide centerline thrust. The Flitzer is well along in development, with a full-size mock-up and some prototype sub-assemblies completed. But despite the progress, the project is abandoned, because the plane's performance is expected to be no better than that of the Me-262. But when the emergency fighter program is announced, Hans Multop already has all the experience and knowledge gained from developing the Flitzer to work from. His next design, the TA-183 Huckabine, will be the culmination of aerodynamic research that his team began in 1942. And one of the major new steps implemented will be the use of fully swept wings. Taking its name from a mischievous cartoon raven, the Huckabine has wings mounted in the middle of its short fuselage and swept back at 40 degrees. It has a pressurized cockpit with a bubble canopy providing excellent all-round vision. The Huckabine's fin is very long and tall, putting the tailplane above the flow of the air as it wraps around the wings, lessening the amount of turbulence. The first design uses a T-tail sitting at the end of a long vertical stabilizer swept back at an angle of 60 degrees. As tests progress, the T-tail gives way to a V-shape that is bent slightly upwards. It is intended that the plane will use the HES 011 jet engine. However, prototypes will use the same Junkers Umo 004 engine found in the Me-262. And like the Flitzer before it, early studies for the aircraft call for it to be equipped with a rocket engine, with enough fuel located in underwing drop tanks for a 200-second rocket burn. But again, the rocket engine is removed before designs move forward. A single jet engine will propel the Huckabine, giving it more range and better fuel economy than the two-engined Me-262. Expected to be able to fly at speeds of 1,000 kilometers per hour and up to an altitude of 45,000 feet, the Huckabine will swoop down from above and blast the bombers with its four 30mm cannons. But will cannons alone be enough? The B-29's revolutionary central fire control system allows the gunners to direct four remote-controlled turrets, each armed with two 50-caliber machine guns through the use of analog computers. Highly advanced for their time, the General Electric designed computers correct for airspeed, target speed, and other factors that can hinder the gunner's accuracy. These improvements make it dangerous for fighters to get too close to the B-29. To combat this, Germany needs an advanced weapon of their own. At the Ruhrstahl Company in Düsseldorf, Dr. Max Kramer is working on just such a weapon. His goal is to build a missile with enough range to allow it to be fired from well out of reach of the bomber's guns, while being guided with enough accuracy to hit its intended target.
During the Second World War, there was a lot of work being done on surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles, guided weapons of various types. There was a bewildering variety of types that the Germans worked on. Not all of them very practical, mind you, but a lot of variety. They were also involved in early designs of air-to-air missiles. I know of one, which doesn't mean there were not more. I know of one, the X4. Fairly small weapon, again, air-to-air. You wanted to use something that was tiny, just by Second World War standards, something you could almost hold in your arms. It is the ancestor of the modern air-to-air missile.
The X4 is guided by signals sent via thin wires that run back to its guidance mechanism on the aircraft. As the missile flies, the wire is reeled out behind it. A small joystick in the plane's cockpit allows the pilot to guide the direction of the missile. That, as well as having enough rocket power to fly for 3.5 miles, makes it the ideal weapon for staying out of range of the B-29's guns. But because it is so difficult for the pilot to judge the distance to the target aircraft from so far back, the missile is armed with a newly developed acoustic-based proximity fuse, known as the Kranich. As the X4 project is well known to aircraft engineers, the Huckabine is designed with the missile specifications and requirements in mind, possibly making it the first instance of a complete weapons system. On February the 28th, 1945, the Luftwaffe High Command examines the emergency fighter proposals and selects a design by Junkers to be developed and produced. The Huckabine comes in second place. But before long it is decided that the Huckabine is a better design, and Kurt Tank is told to plan for full production. Flight tests are scheduled for May of 1945, and 16 prototypes are to be built. Then, on April the 8th, British troops capture the Focke-Wulf facilities, ending any chance that the TA-183 Huckabine will see the prototype stage. The HES-011 engine, still delayed, never makes it into mass production. By the end of the war, only 19 engines have been built. In the months following the war, agents from Allied countries scour Europe for designs and ideas that can be used by their country's aircraft industry.
There were so many projects produced and so many projects found at various aircraft manufacturers that the Allies really didn't know what was actually worth pursuing and what wasn't. And a lot of the Allied aircraft engineers thought that some of this stuff was pie in the sky anyway, and thought that, well, you know, we know what we're doing and we're going to do it our way, which actually was not a very good idea, because the Germans were a long way advanced on their high-speed development of bombers and airplanes, unconventional designs.
Adolf Busemann is visited by a group of American scientists at his lab in Braunschweig, some of whom had attended the Volta Conference in 1935, but had overlooked his research then. It is only now that the Western Allies begin to see the potential of swept wings. The B-47 Stratojet, in development as a straight-winged bomber, is given swept wings when Boeing's chief aerodynamicist relays the information back to the United States. At North American Aviation, the wings of F.J. Fury fighter jet receive a 35-degree sweep before going into production as the F-86 Sabre. After the war, Hans Multop moves to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, under which the US intelligence and military extract scientists from Nazi Germany. Working for the Martin Company, his knowledge of swept-wing designs contributes to later versions of the F-84 and the F-86 Sabre, as well as the experimental X-24 lifting bodyplane. Kurt Tank is offered a job at the Aerotechnical Institute in Cordoba, Argentina, by Juan Perón's government. The ideas behind the Huckabine lift off again as he gathers a team from the Focke-Wulf Design Bureau. As the HES-011 engine is no longer in development, it is replaced with one by Rolls-Royce, the Nene 2. The fuselage is widened to accommodate this larger centrifugal engine. The wings are mounted higher up on the fuselage as compared to the Huckabine. The new aircraft is named the Pulki II. Test flights begin on June the 16th, 1950. The plane reaches the incredible speed of 1,000 kilometers per hour. But as promising as that is, there are other problems. Pilots find the aircraft very difficult to handle, and 2 are killed during test flights. And those are not the only problems Kurt Tank faces. An economic crisis hits Argentina in 1953. The pricey Pulque 2 project is halted, temporarily at first, but in 1955 Juan Perón's government falls, dealing Tank's team another blow. Soon after, the availability of cheap F-86 Sabres makes the development of a homegrown fighter a needless luxury for Argentina. It is not only the Western Allies who benefit from the work of German aviation experts. In the dwindling days of the war, Soviet forces discover the Huckebeins' plans and several prototypes, which are transported back to Russia. Because of this, it is often thought that the Huckebein may have inspired the fabled MiG-15, an aircraft that rivaled the Sabre. And although the MiG-15 and the Huckebein share a number of similarities, such as swept wings, a high rate of climb, an elongated tail fin, this theory has been discredited. The majority of Focke-Wulf's engineers were taken in by the Western Allies. However, as the Soviets had possession of the German Air Ministry, the central repository for all Germany's aviation ideas, they did have all the technical data and designs dealing with swept-wing aircraft, which would have provided them the proof that swept wings were a good avenue to follow. That single B-29 landing in England set in motion events that would be felt for years to come. While it did have the intended consequences of surprising the Germans and forcing them to pour their already thin resources into the development of another new aircraft, it also laid the groundwork for swept wings to be adopted earlier than had the need for an emergency fighter not been so dire. And while the implementation of sweep theory is a boon to aviation progress, it will come back to haunt the United States in the years to come, when the MiG-15 appears in the skies over Korea.
As the storm clouds of World War II darkened the skies over Europe, Nazi Germany's Air Ministry requested designs for a high-performance aircraft that could combine the role of ground attack fighter and heavy-duty dive bomber. In response to this request, two young Austrian aeronautical designers came up with an inventive design, the HU-136 Stubo. The HU stood for Hüter. Before the war, Ulrich and Wolfgang Hüter had applied their talent exclusively to developing gliders for sport and training purposes.
This plane is designed by Ulrich Hüter. Primarily, they designed it for themselves, to fly themselves, to build it themselves. They sold the construction plans of this plane into 21 countries.
In Germany, two well-respected glider pilots and entrepreneurs, Martin Schempp and Wolf Hirt, would manufacture the HU-17 for the Hüter brothers. Adding the Hüter glider to their plane inventory was a sound business decision, as Germany was interested in gliders for training thousands of young Luftwaffe pilots. By now, the Third Reich had gained total control over Germany. The Nazis also harbored ambitious plans for further expansion, using a new type of warfare, blitzkrieg. The Hüter brothers were aware that the tactics of blitzkrieg employed dive bombing, so they presented the German Air Ministry with the radically different 136 Stubo dive bomber. Armed with machine guns and capable of delivering two 250-kilogram bombs. At the front and sides of the armored canopy were slits, through which the pilot, like a medieval knight,
could view his target as he dived to attack. Influenced by their background in building gliders, and in order to save weight, the Hütter brothers decided not to equip the 136 with an undercarriage. Instead, as with this German transport glider, the Stubo would employ a detachable dolly, used purely for takeoff, and jettisoned once the aircraft was airborne. When it came to landing, the gliders relied entirely upon a retractable central skid. Although not having an undercarriage made ground handling difficult, it did achieve a considerable saving in weight. But landing the Stubo dive bomber on a skid posed a problem for the Hütter brothers. While the gliders had no propeller, their dive bomber did. The Hütter brothers solved this problem in a typically inventive way. At the end of each mission, as the Stubo approached its base, the pilot would fire explosive charges to eject the propeller blades, thus allowing the 136 to land on a skid. The fact that the Air Ministry gave the Stubo an official designation is evidence that the dive bomber's design was taken quite seriously. While its estimated speed of 330 miles an hour would have been impressive, overall the Stubo was considered too unconventional and never went into production.
At the end of the day, operational efficiency is what counts, and you cannot operate efficiently in these circumstances. For example, the aircraft after it's landed has got to be removed by a tractor, probably, time-consuming. The propeller has got to be put up back on the aircraft, again very time-consuming, and all this reduces operational efficiency. If you want to have a rapid succession of flights, you are not going to obtain it with an airplane like this.
The Air Ministry had already decided on the Ju-87 Stuka, which in 1936 had seen action in Spain. The Stuka's thoroughly orthodox design made it a safe choice for a mass-produced dive bomber. The Stuka was to remain in production for almost a decade. It served in a number of different roles. Despite the Stubo's superior speed, its lack of a conventional undercarriage and limited pilot vision would not have permitted the flexibility provided by the Stuka, especially during the winters on the Eastern Front. The cancellation of the Stubo project did not dampen the Hütter brothers' enthusiasm for aviation and design. In 1937, the same year that Wolfgang Hütter joined Schempp and Hirt as a designer, Claudius Dornier registered a patent for a fresh approach to aircraft layout. These two events would ultimately see Wolfgang working on one of the most innovative and powerful aircraft of World War II. After the First World War, Dornier and his company became successful in flying boat production. Their advanced Wal design was flying in 1922. It became a tremendous success, selling worldwide. The Wal was powered by two engines placed back to back. This centerline thrust approach had many advantages, and the layout served Dornier well for years to come. In 1934, Dornier produced a conventional twin-engine mail plane. As preparations for war ramped up, it soon morphed into a Luftwaffe bomber, the Do-17. But Dornier was frustrated by the drag factor of the side-by-side engine layout, which he knew was less efficient than his earlier design for the Wal.
The 20s airplanes were a tad underpowered, so if you lose an engine, that's bad. By having them on the center line of the aircraft, you sort of reduce your asymmetric load, simpler. You sort of reduce the problems if you lose an engine. So a lot of flying boats had that, some transport plane had that.
Dornier went back to his patent. He envisioned a new design powered by two engines in the same fuselage, one in the front pulling, the other engine located in the middle, driving a pusher propeller via a long shaft at the rear. This tandem arrangement gave the power of two engines, but without the drag created by engine nacelles on the wings. In 1939, Dornier was working on a new high-speed bomber, and he intended to employ his patented tandem engine design.
You have one propeller pushing and one propeller tracting. Pusher propeller, tractor propeller. That's the approach that Dornier used for their Dornier 335, the Arrow.
Dornier was quite sure that this concept would not only be aesthetically pleasing, but would also deliver flight performance that would be breathtaking compared to conventionally powered aircraft. But Dornier realized that he would need to demonstrate that his revolutionary concept actually worked. To do this, he would turn to Wolfgang Hutter, then chief designer at a test division of Schempp and Hirt. Wolfgang was tasked with developing a proof-of-concept aircraft, the Göttingen Go 9.
Wolfgang Hutter had to arrange all the details for this flying model with the Dornier company. As 1 year later, he had to do it with the Messerschmitt company when they started building the tail, side rudder, the fin and the elevator for the load-carrying glider Messerschmitt 321.
After extensive ground testing, the GO9 made its first flight early in 1940. The aft propeller allowed clean wing surfaces and a good roll rate. It also confirmed that a second engine could be placed in front of the fuselage, providing two power sources with the drag of one, and that meant a faster, more maneuverable aircraft. Just as further tests were refining his innovative design, Dornier was ordered to stop work. With the war going so well for Germany, Göring dictated that all long-range development of new aircraft be cancelled. While Wolfgang Hutter was working on aircraft designs, his brother Ulrich continued his studies, earning his doctorate and making significant contributions to the field of wind power generation.
Uli Hutter beschäftigte sich zu dieser Zeit aber bereits mit der Auslegung von Windkraftwerken, von Windturbinen oder Windenergieanlagen. Und das ist seine Erfindung, die weltweit die Windturbinen revolutioniert hat, indem er die Erkenntnisse aus dem Segelflug, lange, schmale Flügel, umgesetzt hat in den Rotor, die bis dahin meistens kurze, breite Flügel hatten, manchmal viele, meistens viele. Und er hat gesagt, 2 oder 3 schlanke, lange Flügel bringen mehr Wirkungsgrad.
Ulrich's talents would soon be channeled back into the war effort. He joined the FGZ Research Institute in Stuttgart, where he would lead a number of advanced scientific and military research projects. Recovering pilots shot down on enemy territory was a concern for the Luftwaffe, as each day experienced airmen became harder to come by through the attrition of war. Ulrich was part of a project to attach rescue pods on the wings of aircraft which could be used to spirit away stranded pilots. Aircraft like the Me-109, Ju-87, KL-25 and Focke-Wulf 190 were tested with such pods. These aircraft might also have delivered injured troops on the front lines back to German hospitals to receive medical care. In addition to serving as ambulances, these aircraft could also be used as stealthy troop transports. A modified Messerschmitt 109 could drop a pair of soldiers or spies on a secret mission into the heart of enemy territory.
As well, Ulrich experimented with attaching fuel pods to the wings of various aircraft. Like other German scientists of his era, concerned with the area rule, he attempted to find the most aerodynamically efficient design possible. While Ulrich continued his research, in 1942, Claudius Dornier submitted an updated proposal of the DO-335, the aircraft his brother Wolfgang had helped to develop. This time, the German Air Ministry gave the project the green light. Finally, in October 1943, Claudius Dornier was to see his chief test pilot take the company's crowning achievement, the DO-335 Arrow, on its first flight. The 335 was huge for a fighter, as big as many German bombers of the time. The question on onlookers' minds was how would it handle, like a bomber or a fighter?
First flew in the fall of 1943. Quite a large machine. I mean, the thing was huge. Again, it was not designed for subtlety. There's nothing subtle about a Dornier 335. It's a brutish airplane, very fast.
Weighing in at 11,500 pounds, the Arrow was a giant compared to the diminutive 1,500-pound GO-9 test aircraft, which had proved the concept. As if the Arrow wasn't big enough, the Air Ministry seriously considered marrying two 335s together in the same Zilling configuration used with the Heinkel 111Z. The objective was to create a much-needed long-range reconnaissance aircraft, but the idea was doomed to failure. By 1944, the war was going very badly for Germany. The Russians were pressing hard from the east, and by the summer, the Western Allies had landed in France. In the air, British heavy bombers came every night, bringing terrible destruction. At first, the Luftwaffe defended with converted day fighters and bombers, but they proved no match for the RAF's composite wood-constructed Mosquitoes, which served as pathfinders, high-level bombers, and escorts. Clearly, the Luftwaffe needed night fighters designed for the purpose.
By 1942, the Luftwaffe was looking for a next generation of night fighters. The Heinkel 219 would be this fearsome aircraft used against Allied bombers, well, mainly British ones.
The Heinkel company offered one of the most advanced aircraft of the war, the HE-219, but it came late. Expensive and complicated to build, the HE-219 project was dogged by problems. The 219 could climb to 30,000 feet and intercept the RAF's Mosquitoes. But when later versions of the Mosquito could reach a ceiling of 37,000 feet, Heinkel was ordered to stop production of the HE-219.
You're looking at a very complicated machine, very expensive, powerful engines required. Do we actually need it? Can we afford it? By late 1944, the airplane had been cancelled.
Heinkel knew the 219 in its existing form was doomed, but he also knew the Air Ministry was still looking for an aircraft, for long-range reconnaissance and as a night fighter for high-altitude defense against bombers. Heinkel believed that Wolfgang Hutter's expertise in designing gliders could be applied to modifying the 219 for this new role. So he commissioned Wolfgang to adapt the Heinkel 219 and produce an aircraft with sufficient ceiling to evade the RAF's Mosquitoes.
Und so gab es auch eine Ausschreibung für einen Langstreckenaufklärer, der in größerer Höhe fliegen kann. Und für diese Ausschreibung hat Wolfgang Hütter die Hütter 211 angeboten. Zweimotorig mit zwei Jumo 222, mit einem in Holzbauweise, das ganze Flugzeug, mit einem Flügel, der in einem Stück in einer Betonpresse in Schalenbauweise verklebt worden wäre.
Because of critical material shortages, Wolfgang's brief required him to borrow components from the HE-219, as well as other already manufactured parts.
Um schneller fertig zu werden, hat das RLM danach entschieden, dass Hütter nicht seinen eigenen Rumpf baut, sondern dass er den Rumpf von der Heinkel He219 nimmt, aber den Flügel mit Motor und Fahrwerk machen muss. Hauptfahrwerk. Bugrad war ja in der He219 Rumpf schon drin. So kam es zur Hütter 217.
To achieve a fast, high-altitude plane, Wolfgang designed an advanced wing that was much narrower and at least 20 feet longer than the one it replaced. He believed this highly efficient yet lighter wing, made of wood plastic composite, might enable the HU-211 to reach 40,000 feet. Early in the war, the RAF had been very concerned about the threat posed by high-altitude observation aircraft of the type that Wolfgang Hutter was now planning to build. The danger of them flying over Britain unopposed was taken so seriously that a requirement was issued for an ultra-high-altitude fighter to go where Spitfires could not. The result was the Welkin. Like Wolfgang's proposed design, the Welkin employed a long, narrow wing to gain altitude. With their pressurized cockpits, the Welkins could climb even higher than the advanced Mosquitoes. 100 Welkins were ordered. In the end, only 75 were completed. Production was cancelled when it was realized that the likelihood of a serious high-altitude bomber attack on Britain had been exaggerated. Ironically, while the RAF had scores of very high-altitude flying Welkins lying idle because of a threat that never really existed, the Luftwaffe was struggling to develop a similar aircraft to counter a threat that visited them every night. With the HU-211 starting to take shape on Wolfgang Hutter's drafting board, delivery of the first two prototypes was set for February 1945. Apart from the wing, most of the other components for the HU-211 were already in existence. The problem lay in sourcing them from different locations, as the Air Ministry had deliberately decentralized production. This tactic may have been effective in reducing damage by Allied bombing on German aircraft production, but now manufacturers were totally dependent on reliable overland transport for delivery of parts. The supply of materials to factories was being seriously impeded as roads and railways were disrupted by Allied fighter bombers, now flying from their advanced bases in France and Belgium. Against this background, the prospect of Wolfgang's born-again night fighter seeing the light of day was fast slipping away. Other German aircraft like the Heinkel 162 jet fighter, also largely made of wood, were designed and built from scratch in an incredibly short time. Over 300 of these single-engine jets were made in just a few months. They did fly and in a few instances fought. However, the 162 was small and could be built underground in tunnels and disused mines where there was no threat from Allied bombs. By contrast, the 211 had now become a large plane with an 80-foot wingspan, so underground assembly was not an option. In any event, the HU-211 was never completed. In 1944, the two prototypes of Wolfgang's nocturnal Homeland Defender were destroyed in an airstrike. Ironically, there was probably no need for the HU-211, or even the HE-219 for that matter, because Dornier's tandem-engined fighter could actually reach the same altitude as the most advanced Mosquitoes, and it was just going into production as the war ended. Had the German Air Ministry accepted Dornier's proposal for a tandem-powered heavy fighter in 1942, an extremely advanced night fighter was in fact available. All that was required was the addition of radar to the two-seat trainer version, which was always contemplated.
In May of 1944, the 219 was cancelled, and Hitler finally ordered the 335 into immediate production. But by then, the die was cast. The Dornier solution would come too late. Before the war, the Hutter brothers and their partners Schempp and Hirth had enviable reputations within the glider community. They were designers and pilots at the top of their game. After the war, Schempp and Hirth re-emerged as builders and innovators of extremely advanced gliders, and the company is still thriving today. As for the Hutters, they never really enjoyed the recognition they deserved during the war as they transitioned from glider to propeller power. But Ulrich Hutter did eventually master propellers, and in a very big way. After the war, his achievements in designing wind-powered generators became legendary. His airfoil-type fiberglass blades with variable pitch were light in weight and highly efficient. Ulrich's wind generators were also very reliable, achieving over 4,000 hours of operation before experiments ended in 1968. Wolfgang Hutter turned his attention back to a glider project that he had just brought to fruition at the beginning of the war. The Gauffier was a side-by-side training sailplane which for the first time allowed dual instruction for glider pilots.
Wolfgang Hutter, he designed this side-by-side two-seater, and to get the wetted surface as small as possible, they tried to make the fuselage very close, and therefore they used the space of the wing root in the fuselage for the elbows.
By 1945, the Hutters had built 120 of these trainers for the German Air Ministry. Because of its success, the Gauffier-type glider went back into production in 1951. Its aerodynamic wing roots were built by an entirely new method that is employed today for the construction of fiberglass gliders.
The fairing between the fuselage and the wing. As far as I know, for the first time ever, they used fiber-reinforced plastics to build this fairing. The very complicated shape of such a fairing, three-dimensional curves and interconnections and intersections may make very difficult to build it with wood, with plywood, or even with balsa. It's not so easy.
Though the Hutter brothers' innovative aircraft, the Stubo HU-136, did not take flight, their passion for aviation and engineering lives on in modern-day gliders and on wind farms around the world, inspiring new generations of pilots and conservationists.
For decades, numerous historians have studied the Luftwaffe and its failures during the Second World War. What caused an air force that was in many ways vastly superior to the Allies to come crashing down? Is there a distinct turning point that made Germany's aerial arsenal impotent against the combined strength of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union? For the first time ever, put yourself right in the middle of the debate as we try to solve the greatest arguments in the history of aviation. What caused the Luftwaffe to fail? In 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany and later the Führer, enacting complete control over the fatherland. Eager to reclaim the lost territories taken from Germany after the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazi war machine realizes early on that the formation of a strong air force is vital. In 1935, it becomes official on paper, and the Luftwaffe is born. The man put in charge of this department is Hermann Göring, a prominent ace from the Great War.
Goering was a World War I fighter pilot. He was not interested in technology. He said something at one point, he said, well, this device is a box with coils, and I don't like boxes with coils. He still had this sort of, well, if you're courageous and brave, you don't have to worry about technological gizmos.
In building this new air force, the Nazis possess many advantages that other nations do not, including a first-class aircraft industry, symbolized by the names Messerschmitt, Dornier, Heinkel, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf. Brilliant engineers capable of taking aerodynamics to a whole new level, and a highly educated population that can build aircraft on a mass scale. By 1938, production rises to over 5,000 planes. 1 year later, that figure soars to over 8,000, a testament to the importance Nazis place on the doctrine of air power.
What the Germans were trying to do was to employ new machines, new technologies, but to employ them in the service of a very, very old way of war that had served them well in previous conflicts and they felt would continue to serve them well in the future. I think this sets the Germans somewhat apart from neighboring countries in the 1920s and 1930s in that they are not truly looking ahead as much as they are looking back to their old traditions and grafting new technologies onto them.
Before war is declared in August of 1939, Germany's aerial arsenal is impressive to say the least. Ready to go is the Me-109, a superior single-engine fighter, the Junkers 87 Stuka, a terrifying dive bomber, the Heinkel 111 and the Dornier 17 Flying Pencil, two top-of-the-line medium-range bombers. This, in addition to the largest air transport industry in the entire world, exemplified by the Junkers 52, a workhorse that will be at the centerpiece of the German offensive. Even with all these phenomenal aircraft, a key ingredient is missing, as is often noted by Second World War historians: the absence of strategic bombers. This void does not go unnoticed in 1935, when General Walter Wever, realizing their importance, enthusiastically supports the building of long-range aircraft to battle any potential enemy, most likely the Soviet Union.
General Walter Wever was promoting what he called the Urals bomber. He believed that the industrialization, tanks, planes, etc., that was going on in the Urals area had to be demolished if you were going to win a war against Russia.
Wever writes, "Air power carries the war right into the heart of enemy country from the moment war breaks out. It strikes at the very root of the enemy's fighting power and of the people's will to resist."
Yeah, Walter Wever was very much in favour of this long-distance bomber to try and bomb Russia, and that actual project was given the name of the Ural bomber. Wever actually then put specifications out to both Dornier and Junkers for the building of this long-range bomber. Out of this came the Dornier 19 and the Junkers 89. But neither of these aircraft had the performance that was currently available in the United States of the B-17 Flying Fortress. So therefore, neither of those airplanes really progressed very far beyond a couple of prototypes.
Dying due to a plane crash in 1936, his doctrine epitomized by the Dornier 19 and the Junkers 89 are scrapped by Goering.
Goering, I think, didn't go along with this because he rather took the view that Hitler had, that they could win by blitzkrieg, and they wouldn't be required to get into this lengthy process of using heavy bombers.
Inquiring as to how many twin-engine planes can be made for every four-engine one, the answer given to him is 2.5. The Field Marshal's response is that the Führer does not ask me how big my bombers are, but how many there are. It is important to note that the decision not to build long-range bombers cannot be considered a failure. For Germany, the raw materials needed to build such planes would require large amounts of rubber, metals and fuel, all of which would have to be imported for a hefty price. Of the 4,500 tons of aluminium needed per month for aircraft production, only half is available during the Wefer era. The Air Force that he and others envisioned was simply uneconomic at the time. What truly represented the German way of war is instead a tactical Air Force.
The German war of movement attempted to defeat as much of the enemy army as possible within the opening weeks of fighting. So the tactical level of fighting for an individual position, and then the operational level of attempting to defeat an enemy army. But arguably, Germany had never been very good, and this would go back to Prussia before it, at the kind of long-term strategic planning that the Allies were so skilled at in World War II. Arguably, this was because the Germans felt they had to win all their wars quickly or they would not win them at all, and that attempting to play strategic warfare with the vast economic and industrial resources of the United States was a losing game from the start.
Working closely with those on the ground, the Luftwaffe is wildly successful as the Second World War begins. Poland is easily demolished. Norway is taken away from the British effortlessly. The Low Countries and even the power of France cannot resist German might during the year 1940. It appears that nothing can stop Nazi forces from gobbling up the continent of Europe.
Certainly the Luftwaffe played an extremely important part in the opening German victories of World War II. And when we say opening victories, we don't mean the first 6 months, we mean the first 2 years, in which it looked like a German victory was very much in the offing. The German Air Force was very skilled at the tactical level, that is, cooperation with the ground forces. It was extremely successful at the operational level of war, the intermediate level, that is, carrying out campaigns against enemy supply lines, for example, feeding troops and men to the front.
With the fall of France, Britain is the only nation standing in the way of this German juggernaut. In order to finish off the rebellious island nation, a plan known as Operation Sea Lion is approved. It calls for the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority over the English Channel. Once this is completed, German forces will be deployed onto British soil. However, during this pivotal battle, the Luftwaffe is dealt its very first aerial defeat. Primarily through the use of Spitfires and Hurricanes, the English are able to push back German planes from the coast to Britannia. While this monumental struggle ensues, we discover one of the Luftwaffe's greatest failure, its lack of coordination with the Kriegsmarine.
Goering said, "Everything that flies is mine," and bitterly fought against any attempts by the German Navy to get a hold of a piece of the air action. When they wanted long-range aircraft assigned to them, Goering, actually, Dönitz went behind Goering's back directly to Hitler, and I think got a dozen of the Focke-Wulf Condors assigned to him. Goering, when he found out about this, was furious and actually cut off all cooperation with the Kriegsmarine at this point.
Despite pleas by Admiral Raeder to create a separate air force for the Navy, Goering refuses to give the green light to any potential inter-service rival. The roots for this conflict come from each service's desire to be recognized as the one who brought victory to the fatherland.
Of course, there has always been the rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force from the point of view that we refer to ourselves as the Imperial Navy and refer to the Air Force as the Nazi Air Force. So that differentiated us already in attitude and character.
In hindsight, Goering's decision proves fatal as Germany and Britain battle it out in both the skies and on the high seas. Winston Churchill would write that the greatest threat to Britain was the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boat submarines are enormously successful in sinking English shipping.
I think Churchill was quite correct that the Battle of the Atlantic was the one front where Britain could really lose the war because they were so dependent on supplies, even food, coming from North America, that if that lifeline was cut, Britain would have been really in dire straits.
With the defeat of France, bases are built right on their coast, giving these vessels an even bigger theatre to disrupt the lifeline of Britain. Had aerial forces worked closely with these U-boats, or if a separate naval aviation wing was created, it would be a game-changer in Germany's war against Britain. Proof of this can be seen in the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, an aircraft that despite its limitations is excellent in attacking English ships. With no more than a dozen planes, they successfully sink 85 merchant vessels and over 300,000 tons of shipping.
When the Germans started to deploy a fairly small number of the Focke-Wulf 200 Condors to attack Allied shipping, they were able to have really a devastating effect.
Also, had the new invention of a magnetic mine been dropped by Luftwaffe planes into the English Channel, its enemy could have been starved out of the war. This marks the first major failure of the Luftwaffe.
It was our common complaint of us, the little people, let's say, that there was no coordination whatsoever between the German Navy and the German Air Force.
With a stalemate on the Western Front, Germany decides to keep the British at bay and instead focus attention on their ally, the Soviet Union. Enacting a war plan known as Operation Barbarossa, some 3 million Nazi soldiers equipped with rifles, tanks and planes begin the biggest land assault in history. Using less than 3,000 aircraft, a force smaller than that utilized in the battle against France, Germany is miraculously able to push back Soviet forces to the suburbs of Moscow. The decision to launch Operation Barbarossa exposes the Luftwaffe to its second major failure: the lack of maintenance and repair on the ground. When a German aircraft is damaged, it is sent back to the fatherland for repair. When fighting a relatively short and tactical war against France, this particular system works fairly well. When fighting a long, drawn-out war of attrition against the communists, however, it proves to be a gigantic blunder. In the Soviet Union, with the fighting taking place far away from the major cities of Germany, the time it takes engineers to repair a damaged aircraft and have it sent back to the front is enormous. And by 1941, less than 30% of the Luftwaffe's airfields are operational, a fact that is almost inconceivable when taken into account that Germany is fighting a two-front struggle. As Field Marshal Erhard Milch would reflect after the war, the vertical organization in 4 territorial determined Luftflotte commands was grossly inadequate for launching a war well beyond the borders of the Third Reich. The attack of June 22, 1941 would in retrospect be a catastrophic mistake. For those like Goering, men who had never fought on the Eastern Front during the First World War, they would grossly underestimate the Soviet will and the industrial capacity of a regime thought to be so backwards by Hitler. Moving its factories far beyond the Ural Mountains, they are out of range of German bombers. The ghost of General Wefer comes back to haunt the Luftwaffe. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany declares war against the United States. Before this decision is made, Hitler shrugs off any suggestion of a possible American threat in the form of an arsenal of democracy. In declaring war, Hitler foolishly adds yet another enemy to the Third Reich's list, one with a production capacity that is unparalleled. With 2 oceans separating America from the fighting, its people can go on producing without the threat of bombardment. Britain would have hauled the flag down long ago if it had not been for America's support, one field marshal said. With Germany by this time experiencing severe shortage of aluminium and copper, America is fully stocked of these and other vital raw materials. By 1944, the United States is able to churn out over 96,000 planes per year, 1 every 5 minutes, more than double that of the Germans. Before this catastrophic decision is made, it is important to note that by 1940, even Britain, with its shipping being torpedoed at an unprecedented rate, is outproducing Germany in aircraft. The British are able to improvise, and as a result produce outstanding planes like the de Havilland Mosquito, an aircraft made from plywood. In contrast, by 1941, with Nazi forces engaged in a two-front war, total production is just over 11,000 planes, a yearly increase of only 3,000 from when the war began. It is clear that the Third Reich's total output is only a fraction of what it could be.
One of the failures of the German Luftwaffe was their inability ever to work out a sane procurement and production process. Prototypes would be built and abandoned. They would be rebuilt and altered by Hitler's order and abandoned, and rebuilt a third time and perhaps put into production as an aircraft very, very different from what the original designers had intended.
This lack of planning and foresight can be attributed to the man who took control of Luftwaffe production in 1936, long before the war began. His name is Ernst Udet. An outstanding ace from the First World War, he is put in control by Goering, replacing Wilhelm Wimmer. His appointment to this powerful position marks the third, and possibly the greatest failure of the Luftwaffe.
Goering placed one of his World War I fighter ace buddies, Ernst Udet, in charge of technical developments. Udet really didn't know anything about this stuff.
Udet's forerunner Wimmer has been outstanding in overseeing the Luftwaffe's second-generation aircraft during the pre-war era, including the Me-109, the Junkers 87, and the Heinkel 111. With Udet as his replacement, however, the next line of aircraft is a far cry from their predecessors.
One of his hobby horses was dive bombers. He had seen, actually, in America, interestingly, between the wars, a demonstration of dive bombing, thought every German bomber should be made into a dive bomber, and then even ordered this new four-engine bomber, Heinkel 177, under development, to be made into a dive bomber. Well, Heinkel himself, who was, after all, an engineer who understood this, kept trying to talk him out of it, said this is ridiculous, but was overruled, and so they had to go back and strengthen the wings of the 177 to try to reduce drag so it could actually dive at high speeds. They tried mounting the engines in pairs instead of having four engines like you would normally think you would do on a bomber. They were mounted front and back in a single pod on each wing. This resulted in so much heat being generated that the engines were constantly overheating. So it really, I mean, it was a crazy idea, and it led directly to delays, and I guess you can really say the ultimate failure of Germany to field an effective four-engine bomber during the war.
The Heinkel 177, with its odd tandem engine arrangement and an insane requirement by Udet to dive bomb, makes this plane a complete disaster from start to finish. The aircraft becomes known as the dead racehorse, with only a handful ever getting the chance to fly.
The Heinkel 177 and the Me-210 go hand in hand as one of the Luftwaffe's major disasters.
The Messerschmitt 210, a replacement for the Me-110, is full of problems that are never ratified.
When he came up with his Messerschmitt 210, the RLF said, oh yes, that's very good, let's immediately, we'll order 10,000. Or whatever it was, but they went into mass production and the thing had hardly flown. It was a complete and utter disaster for Messerschmitt, which he'd never lived down, and they had to convert a lot of the built Me-210s into Me-410s by taking the aeroplanes to pieces again and reassembling them with new parts to turn it into a flyable and operational machine.
As one aircraft representative is overheard saying, everything turns to dust in Udet's hands. Only one aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190, is considered a success under his watch. A reluctance to make the hard decisions also proves costly, as resources are diverted to projects that are simply unfeasible during wartime. By 1941, the need is for long-range strategic bombers, with America producing the B-17 Flying Fortress and the British reworking the Avro Manchester into the four-engine Avro Lancaster. Germany, in contrast, falls dramatically behind the Allies in producing four-engine bombers. Udet, with all his failures, commits suicide in 1941, leaving the Luftwaffe in shambles. With a Soviet victory at Stalingrad, German forces are pushed back, marking the beginning of the end. And as American and British bombers begin destroying German factories and city centers from the sky, the philosophy that General Weber endorsed years ago is coming true. Strategic bombing is proving vital in weakening the German war machine. Under the command of Field Marshal Erhard Milch, production is able to climb to 25,000 planes a year, a respectable increase, but nothing compared to what the Allies are able to produce.
U.S. procurement policies, which become a giant bureaucracy, embodied in the War Department and soon thereafter, World War II, embodied in the Pentagon. The Germans were simply not able to compete on that level.
In 1944, Germany is being outmaneuvered in the realm of aircraft by the rate of over 4 to 1. At this point, there is simply no way to compete with the United States or the Soviet Union. While much is written by historians about Allied coordination in resources and materials, little can be found about Germany's willingness to use its own allies' means of production to their advantage. This is yet another failure of the German Luftwaffe. Without a common goal and being on different sides of the world, the Empire of Japan cannot be considered Germany's biggest ally. Its most powerful friend during the war is instead the Italians. Unfortunately, with their own air force in shambles, the Nazis are reluctant to give them the licenses and the engines to build German planes on Italian soil. This proves to be a pivotal mistake, as Italy could have tripled aircraft production with German assistance, producing possibly 30,000 planes during the war. Also, Italian factories would have been out of bombing range for the Allies during the year 1942 and might have changed the outcome in the Mediterranean. Germany's other allies, Romania, Hungary and Finland, are all capable of making aircraft, but lack the knowledge and resources that the fatherland can provide. Had these nations been granted licenses to build Nazi aircraft on their own soil, there was a good chance that this coalition might have tipped the scale in favor of Germany during its pivotal battle against the Soviets during 1941. The decision not to fully utilize the resources of these nations can be attributed to Germany's desire to be the dominant power. There is widespread resentment against the Italians by top Nazi leaders who see them as merely riding off the coattails of German success.
Our feeling always was, with the experience of the First World War already, we wish the Italians were on the other side.
People like Hermann Goering see these smaller countries as the providers of natural resources, with the fatherland supplying the finished products. This marks another tragic failure of the Luftwaffe. In early 1944, Germany unveils the Messerschmitt 262, a revolutionary jet plane that can hopefully take down the flying fortresses and mosquitoes that are destroying their cities.
Later on, of course, they produced the world's first production model, general use jet aircraft in the form of the Messerschmitt 262, the Me-262. The Me-262 as a pure fighter was an amazing sight to see, and in fact, anyone looking at it today is still struck by the modern and sleek lines.
Now, the Me-262 was, in my opinion, I've stated this many times, the most formidable aircraft of World War II.
The Me-262 is years ahead of its time, symbolizing the fatherland's creativity and innovation. In many ways, however, the Me-262 also symbolizes Nazi indecision.
Unfortunately, the Me-262 got caught in a very, very arcane and difficult procurement process within Germany, wherein basic designs were put forward by competent engineers. They were then changed by upper echelons within the Luftwaffe, and of course they had to pass the Hitler test. And no aircraft passed the Hitler test without being significantly modified. The Me-262 is no exception.
After Professor Messerschmitt tells Hitler that the aircraft can carry up to 1,000 kilograms of bombs, Field Marshal Milch, in a fit of rage, tells the Führer that even the smallest infant can see that the 262 is a fighter, not a bomber. After months of wavering, the plane goes ahead as a fighter-bomber, taking the sting out of what could have been a ferocious punch. They may possess this wonder weapon, but have few men that can fly it. This becomes the Luftwaffe's final failure, its pilots' lack of training. During its heyday, Germany's finest were given approximately 250 hours of flight time before being sent out to face their enemy, considerably more than the British. And with the Second World War going exceedingly well during 1940 and 1941, the Luftwaffe arrogantly minimizes its training program, figuring that the war will soon be over. By 1942, as the tide begins turning, German pilots are given less than 200 hours of practice flying, while Allied pilots are given over 300. With the war turning against them, shortcuts are made to churn out every single pilot possible. Despite this augmentation, by 1944 the average training time drops to just under 100 hours. In some cases, just a quarter of what P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt pilots were given. With air superiority lost over German soil, it becomes a turkey shoot for American and British aviators as they begin gunning down Me-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s with ease.
At D-Day, in the final planning, the head of Allied Tactical Aviation was asked, well, what are we going to do about the German fighters? He said there aren't going to be any German fighters over the landing beaches. And he was essentially right, because they'd been wiped out by then.
The decision not to build a pilot training infrastructure like its enemies causes the Luftwaffe to run desperately short on experienced men. So by the time planes like the Me-262, the Arado 234 jet bomber, the Me-163, a rocket-powered interceptor, the Dornier 335 Arrow, the fastest piston-engine plane of the Second World War, and all the other revolutionary aircraft that could have been the difference-maker on both fronts, it is a case of too little, too late. The defeat of the Luftwaffe can be attributed to its lack of direction. With the war going in Germany's favor, Hitler, Goering, and Udet were blinded by a false optimism. The tactical war doctrine that they favored initially was being replaced by a long, drawn-out strategic war that they were ill-prepared for. The arrogant nature in which they brushed off the industrial power of the United States and the Soviet Union. The mismanagement of their own country's aircraft industry on a grand scale, and the lack of infrastructure, production, and training during the Second World War's most decisive years would cause the Luftwaffe to write its own epitaph.